We continue our exposition of the book of Romans. I would like us today to deal with verse 25 of chapter 2 all the way to verse 29. But for purposes of context, I would like to begin from verse 23. You who make your boast in the law, do you dishonor God through breaking the law? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. As it is written, for circumcision is indeed profitable if you keep the law. But if you are a breaker of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Therefore, if an uncircumcised man keeps the righteous requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision? And will not the physically uncircumcised, if he fulfills the law, judge you, who even with your written code and circumcision are a transgressor of the law? For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly. And circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but from God. Paul continues with the exposition of the subject of God's justice, but more importantly on the need to fulfill the righteous requirements of the law. And therefore in verse 23 we've just read that when we boast in the law, when we boast that we possess the law of God and yet we do not fulfill it, we dishonor God through breaking the law. I would like to underscore the fact that any sin, any breaking of God's law is dishonor against God. It is a futile exercise to usurp the authority of God. It is treasonous. It is the attempt to overturn or subdue the kingdom of God by imposing our own law in his government. And so we dishonor God when we break God's law. And he says in verse 24, for the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. You possess the law, Paul says, but then you do not fulfill it. So what really happens is that God is blasphemed. God is spoken ill of. Because when people point at you and say, look at those who are men who possess the law, they are supposed to be followers who fulfill the righteous law of God, and they do not fulfill that law. And therefore, people undermine the kingdom of God because of our conduct. I would like to firstly convey the fact that while this relates to the Jew, and while this is not asking us to be justified before God by the law, it really is still Paul's effort to draw attention to the fact that possession of the law in itself does not redeem. Being a churchgoer, being baptized, partaking of the elements and the symbols of the Christian faith do not necessarily lead to redemption or salvation. So that is true for us today. We could well be born in a Christian family. We could well have our names written in the church register. We could well serve in the church. We could do all of those externalities, external things, and yet not be in a state of grace. Paul goes on to say that circumcision is indeed profitable if you keep the law. That if all you are, as he would of course be talking to the Jews, is possess a physical circumcision, if all you have is circumcision of your private parts, that is not profitable to God, neither is it profitable to you. Because circumcision is only profitable if it leads to something. It was of course God's command to be circumcised, but that would have meant that if you are circumcised, you are part of God's covenant. Part of that God's covenant means that God meets his obligations, but it also means that you meet your obligations to him. It's not a one-way covenant. It's a two-way covenant, because covenants are not made by one person or one party. They are made by two parties. We have to fulfill the obligations that are required in our covenants with God. In modern times and in popular Christianity, what we hear is demands of what God himself has promised. And yet, when God calls us to fulfill our part of the bargain, when God requires us to live in obedience, to take up our cross, to not be ashamed of the gospel, to be his witnesses, his followers, his disciples, no matter what, we turn away from that requirement. And we continue demanding that God fulfill his part of the promises that he has made in our covenant with him, and yet we refuse to fulfill ours. That is not scriptural. God calls us to fulfill our part of the covenant as he enables us to do so. And so when we hear this kind of modern Christianity that preaches cheap grace, that holds God to account, that calls God to fulfill his promises while we live without obedience to his law, that is not biblical Christianity. Paul goes on to say, if you are a breaker of the law, your circumcision is undone. It has become uncircumcision. If an uncircumcised man, Paul continues, keeps the righteous requirements of the law, this uncircumcised man will be counted as circumcised if he keeps the law. What's important here is what follows, what the circumcision really symbolizes. It symbolizes obedience, commitment to each other, commitment to the covenant that is made between these two parties. And that if you keep the law of God, Paul says, if deep within your heart you are really circumcised, then you will keep the law of God. But if your circumcision, as I said earlier, is all of only your private parts, if it does not go beyond that, that circumcision is null and void. It becomes uncircumcision. This therefore includes the Gentiles in this covenant, that even though they were not necessarily those of the circumcision, and yet they were those who strove and worked to fulfill the law of God as they sought him. But I also again want to revert to what I said earlier. When we talk about this passage, he's not talking about access to God. What Paul again is trying to do is to indict every one of us, that even if you are circumcised, that is not justification before God. That your justification before God must be based on absolute fulfillment of God's law, complete obedience to God's righteous law. And we know that when that ruler is applied, all of us fall short. And Paul will climax on that point later on in chapter 3. And so Paul is still in the mission of trying to draw attention to the fact that externalities, outward religion, routines, all of these things that we do are not necessarily the basis of our redemption. They do not acquire grace before God. They are by no means our bridge to God, no matter what we think of them. No matter how hard we work. Martin Luther would work as a monk, day in, day out, confessing his sins and wondering what it would take for his sins to be forgiven. It is said of him that during the confessions that he would go to the priest and confess his sins for hours and hours. He would then walk away feeling that the weight and the burden of his sins has been lifted. But as immediately as he crosses the door of the church, he would go back again because he would have just remembered other sins that he forgot to confess. The weight was too heavy to bear. And that is the story of any man and woman who has sought to satisfy God through the law. So Paul is drawing this attention here. We cannot be justified by the law. that you must fulfill God's righteous law for you to be justified before God. And Paul will deal with this subject over and over again through the book of Romans. For us to be brought to Christ, we must first recognize our futility. We must recognize our depravity and our incompetence, our inability to fulfill the law of God.